What happens when you decorate a turd and present it as new? It's still a Rationality Rules video.
He is coming. Cover your butt.
Rationality Rules has released his scientific evidence for why he thinks that it's unfair for trans women to compete against cis women. As it turns out, this is just a repackaging of Steven's first video. When I first watched Steven's video, I wanted to just copy and paste my old video and upload it as a response because there's nothing new in this video that hasn't already been covered by myself and others. Steven makes the same arguments as before, minus the blatantly transphobic rhetoric. The argument that Steven is using is, men are better at sports than women. When men transition and undergo hormone replacement therapy, they are still better at sports than women. Let's dive into the science-filled disaster and see what we find. First, let's remind ourselves of what Steven himself said was his biggest blunder in his first video.
Now this was, in my opinion, my biggest intellectual blunder. At the time, after explaining some of the reasons as to why men have an athletic advantage over women, I intended to show that while HRT evidently sufficiently reduces many of these advantages, such as hematocrit, it hasn't been shown to sufficiently reduce many other advantages, such as height, width, limb proportions, muscle fibre type, heart size, lung capacity, and muscle fibre.
Steven agrees with his critics that his biggest blunder was comparing cis women to cis men and drawing conclusions from this comparison on the athletic performance of trans women. I'm sure that now Steven has gone out and found studies comparing cis women to trans women.
Before the onset of puberty, the competitive performance between boys and girls is largely the same. There are some differences, of course, and they're likely the product of both biological and societal factors, but the two groups are not entirely worlds apart. By the end of puberty, however, they very much are.
2,000 men in the world at the moment that can run 100 metres faster than the greatest female sprinter of all time.
Oh dearie me.
Indeed. You had one job, Steven. Don't compare cis men to cis women when trying to compare trans women to cis women, and you could only make it 6 minutes before stumbling over the exact same mistake as before. To further illustrate the point, let's look at all the scientific literature that Steven cites. In total, Steven cites 38 sources. One source is missing from Steven's list after he was caught citing the anti-trans website Fair Play for Women. Whoops! Showed your hand a little bit too much there, didn't we, Steven? Out of the remaining 37 sources, 14 are YouTube videos. Some are news outlets, but mostly it's people giving opinions on trans athletes. Steven uses most of these to show that he can't be transphobic since others are worse. Next, 3 sources are news articles. These are not scientific articles, nor are they peer-reviewed. Finally, 6 are record-keeping, sports records, reports, etc. The remaining 14 are science-related sources. Out of these, 1 is a description of androgen insensitivity syndrome. While interesting, it does not provide any insight into the potential performance differences between cis women and trans women. Another is guidelines on hormone therapy. While this source is related to trans individuals, and these guidelines are based on science, this is a booklet. It is far too broad to get anything more than basic information on the effects of HRT. For example, in their section called, "What physical effects will hormone treatment have on me?" they respond with, "Muscle bulk and power may be reduced." This kind of statement, while accurate, is not accurate enough for this discussion. This leaves us with 12 sources based on peer-reviewed science that can be used to answer the question, do trans individuals have an advantage in sports performance over cis individuals? So, what does Steven do with the 12 peer-reviewed articles that he cites? Well, he compares cis women to cis men, and then, from this, concludes that this is an equal comparison as cis women to trans women. You know, the thing that he said was his biggest blunder, he does again.
Before the onset of puberty, the competitive performance between boys and girls is largely the same. There are some differences, of course, and they're likely the product of both biological and societal factors, but the two groups are not entirely worlds apart.
2,000 men in the world at the moment that can run 100 metres faster than the greatest female sprinter of all time. 2,000 men.
1,500 of the top male tennis players could beat Serena Williams.
You see, I absolutely understand why we have and still do categorize sports based upon sex, as it's simply the case that the vast majority of males have significant athletic advantages over females. To illustrate this, let's take another look at the junior world records, but this time highlight in pink those owned by girls and in blue those owned by boys. Likewise, in the 1500 metre, boys consistently outperform girls, but again, it's not until male puberty that the gap becomes staggering. Hence, the gender gap can be fairly correlated to male puberty, in which males go from the same testosterone levels as females, that being typically between 0.3 and 2.4 nanomoles per litre, all the way up to being typically between 7 and 32 nanomoles per litre. Another study, this time on 62 postmenopausal females who were given testosterone levels of 7 nanomoles per litre, which is that seen in pubertal boys, exhibited a 4.4% increase in muscle mass.
Did you spot the trick at play? Woodford utilised a basic bait and switch. He invited us to discuss the counter that trans women on HRT don't have an advantage due to said HRT. That was what he advertised. He then went on to assert that many of said traits remain in spite of HRT. That's when the switch took place. Instead of referencing articles on the differences between cis women and trans women who have undergone HRT, Woodford goes on to roll out articles discussing the differences between cis women and cis men.
This is Essence of Thought responding to Stephen 2 months ago. Stephen's argument has changed so little in 2 months that we can just use the same responses as we did before. Right off the bat, Stephen is comparing the effect of testosterone on cis women. Remember, he is trying to convince us that trans women on HRT have an unfair advantage. It would have been nice if he presented a peer-reviewed study that compares athletic performance of trans women to cis women. Of the 12 studies that Stephen cites, only 4 actually talk about athletic performance. And of these 4 studies, only 2 compare cis women to trans women. One of these 2 studies Stephen agrees with.
Add to this Joanna Harper study, in which she measured 8 trans women runners before and after HRT and found their performance to be comparable in light of age grading, and I think there's a strong case to be made.
As far as the other study, this is what Stephen has to say.
But when it comes to the burden of proof in reference to whether or not trans women who transitioned after male puberty have an unfair advantage, I think that it depends on the sport. The limited studies that we do have tell us very clearly that HRT reduces their red blood cell count and hemoglobin to within the range of 46xx women, that it dramatically increases their body fat, and that it significantly reduces their muscle mass. However, these same studies also tell us very clearly that HRT has no effect on their height, width, or limb length, very limited to no effect on their heart and lung size, limited effect on their muscle fiber type, and that it actually increases their aerial bone mineral density.
First, let's point out a blatant lie by Stephen. The study that Stephen is referring to is a study called Transsexuals and Competitive Sports by Louis G. Gurin and Mathis J. Canbunk. Yeah. First take. You can tell that this is the study that he's referring to because the table and graph that he shows match the ones found in the study. According to Stephen, this study compares red blood cell count, hemoglobin, body fat, muscle mass, height, width, limb length, heart size, lung size, and muscle fiber type. As it turns out, the study only compares plasma testosterone levels, muscle mass, levels of hemoglobin, and insulin growth factor. Where Stephen got the rest of the comparison is beyond me, and it most certainly not from the study that he shows on screen. To help further hide his lies, you'll notice that Stephen doesn't show a single table or graph to back up his claim. While he was willing to show the results when talking about hemoglobin, there is nothing when he talks about heart size, lung size, limb length, or muscle fiber type. To make matters worse for Stephen, this study does actually comment on fairness in sports. The authors of this study have this to say. The pivotal question is this: can reassigned transsexuals compete fairly with others of their new sex? Our data are limited and do not provide insight into all pertinent aspects. In competitive sports, in all likelihood, small differences may be critical for winning or losing. Our analysis is not refined enough to detect small differences, allowing only an approximation. For male to female, there is an element of arbitrariness. there is no conclusive evidence, pro or con, that the prenatal, perinatal testosterone exposure of men has an impact on future physical traits. To summarize all of this, out of the 38 sources that Stephen gave, only 2 compare trans women to cis women. Harper's study came to the conclusion that trans women did not perform better than cis women, and Gorin and Bunk's results were inconclusive. So, what does Stephen conclude?
However, in explosive events, such as weightlifting, combat sports, hammer throw, and sprinting, I not only think that the burden has not been met, I think that the research that we have done has made it heavier than ever. Which is to say that the attributes granted from male puberty that play a vital role in explosive events, such as height, width, limb length, and fast twitch muscle fibers, have not been shown to be sufficiently mitigated by HRT in trans women.
Just to remind you, the study that Stephen cites in order to come to this conclusion, Transsexuals and Competitive Sports, does not contain any information on
height, width, limb length, and fast twitch muscle fibers.
This is a blatant lie by Stephen. Also, Stephen is again trying to shift the burden of proof. He is asking others to prove him wrong rather than presenting evidence for his claim. Stephen comes to this conclusion in the same way that he did the last time, comparing cis men to cis women, and by ignoring the actual literature that compares trans women to cis women. To make matters worse, Stephen lies about the content of the studies in order to push his anti-trans agenda. Stephen claimed that he understood what his biggest mistake was, comparing cis men to cis women, and concluding that this comparison applied to trans women who had undergone HRT. But this new video only shows that he either didn't understand or he cares more about bashing on trans individuals than he cares about intellectual honesty.